Guys, we have Coach Don Kennedy with us today, and we're just going to ask him a few questions and see if he gives us a few civil answers. The first question is very simple. It says, where and when were you born?
I was born in Coney Island on April 25th, 1907.
Wow. What's that add up to? It says, tell us about your parents and your siblings.
Well, my father was from the far Adirondacks. He grew up in mining territory, worked in the mines for a while before he came down to New York City. My mother was a graduate of Elmira College for Women, but was sent up there from her home in Charleston, South Carolina.
Why did she leave Charleston?
Pardon me?
Why did she leave Charleston?
Well, they wanted to send her to a women's college, and there were very few of them in that day. Elmira was one of the better known.
So where did she meet your father?
My father became the manager of his uncle's restaurant, and my mother was a little ahead of her day. She was working in the restaurant at the time when he met her.
So she never went back home.
Oh, yeah, she went back home.
It says, how would you describe your formative years?
She went back home to funerals, and I went with her.
No, but when she came up, she got married and stayed here.
Oh, yes.
And she lost the southern accent.
Not ever.
Really?
Not ever.
How old was your mom when she died?
71.
It says, how would you describe your formative years? Growing up.
Well, I thought I had a wonderful youth. Looking back at it now, I grew up in a fantastic Coney Island situation, which is probably the Disneyland of its day. There were 3 beautiful amusement parks down there. There's one called Luna Park, one called Steeplechase, and one called Dreamland. Dreamland burned down in 1912, and my father had, by that time, been appointed as the head of all the scenic railways in Coney Island. There were 7 of them, and they all belonged to the inventor of the railroads, L.A. Thompson. There's still a ride in Coney Island called the L.A. Thompson ride.
So where did you attend grammar school and high school?
Well, my father inherited 3 restaurants in New York from the uncle that he originally worked for, and we had to move to the east side of New York. It was the worst time of my life. My brother and I wanted to go home. There wasn't any home. It was a tough situation where there were an awful lot of tough kids in the area. And I went to St. Gabriel's Grammar School for about 1.5 years, and then we moved over to Bay Ridge, where I went to Our Lady Perpetual Help until the 6th grade, when I transferred to PS 118, which was at 59th Street and 4th Avenue in Bay Ridge. I went to high school at Manual Training High School, where I made the mistake of being in the technical course, because when I was in about the 5th grade, they created Brooklyn Technical High School, which is probably the #1 technical high school in the country today. And they moved us from a very nice little co-ed situation down to a factory building in Flatbush Avenue Extension. I was in the graduating class of 1924.
How did you get involved in basketball there? Or did you? When did you start getting involved in basketball?
In grammar school.
And why?
Well, we had a coach who was not a coach because he didn't know enough about that, but he was very interested, and he even put up a basket in the cellar, which was about 6 feet high.
You think if you didn't move from Coney Island to Brooklyn, your basketball interests would have been the same?
Well, I hope so. I always liked the game of basketball. I took part in all sports, but even in grammar school, I was a fair basketball player.
How about college?
College, I was not eligible for, as I was supposed to be a pro.
We want to tell us about that?
Well, when I was maybe 16 years old, I was sort of drafted by the amateur champions of Brooklyn, called the Brooklyn Hilltops, originally the Bay Ridge Hilltops. And from there, I was drafted, so to speak, into professional basketball, where I played under George Norman, who had several teams playing around the East, and where I met Honey Russell, who became a great friend of mine over the years, in spite of the fact we were rivals in basketball.
Now, what college was that, Coach?
Well, I went to Savage School for Physical Education, which was a 3-year college. Got out of there in 1928, and in 1929 they made the four-year degree law, where you, in order to be qualified now for, let's say, the New York City phys ed job, you had to have a 4-year degree. So I went to NYU and picked up a degree in education, a BS in education, and a master's in in administration and supervision. And I took the 34 points toward a doctorate, but never finished the rest of the...
We'll call you doctor anyway.
No, thanks.
Now, you told you were ineligible. Was that the game in Brooklyn or Newark?
Yeah,
Where you got caught? What happened
That's
there?
where I was caught. There were several others caught.
What happened?
Well, the dean of the college, a man by the name of Wendelken, who was a well-known basketball player himself, originally was called King Wendelken. He was tipped off to go and watch a game we were playing at the Newark Men's Club. The Newark Men's Club team was formed a lot from the famous high school that won so many games there. They won, I think, 139 straight games without being defeated.
Was the Passaic 1-5?
It was the Passaic 1-5. But we were, at the time I was playing all over the East, because factually I often wondered whether it was because I was a fair ball player, I was a center, by the way, or because I had the use of my father's car.
So what happened with Wendelken?
Well, Wendelken didn't have to say a word. I knew the answer there. There were several of us, and we were all...
he spotted you there. Now, around this time you met Lou Gehrig. Were you in school with Lou Gehrig?
When I enrolled in Savage and started in September, I didn't know Gehrig was in it. I knew Gehrig. He'd given a lot of publicity through making the Yankees. And they lined us up by twos, and I'm facing this big guy, and it turned out to be Lou. And so we were fair friends for a while. At the end of our first year, Lou did not come back for the second. He came to Savage because he didn't think he would last long enough in baseball, and he wanted a degree in physical education. Of course, you know the answer to that one.
You both did well. Now, your coaching career actually started how? It was an accident, or?
No, I was actually what I was doing. I was shooting baskets up at the local parish club called the Mission Club, and some kids I knew from the neighborhood came up and said, "Don, you have to coach us." And I explained that I was trying to get out of college, and I was trying to play some basketball around the East to make a little money. And they said, "But Don, we just lost to Ben Israel 36-0. So what could you do? I said, "All right, I'll coach you." And incidentally, 5 years later, that team beat the Brooklyn Jewels the year they were the world's champions.
Your team?
That's right.
Was your coaching style the same then as it was, say, 40 years later?
I doubt it. Well, I've always been what you'd call a teacher of fundamentals. I believe that you had to teach ball players to know their fundamentals before you ask them to do any complicated maneuvers out on the floor.
I see in all your biographies it says your first coaching job was the New York Dental College?
That's right. My first official coaching job was at New York Dental College, where I got that job because I was supposed to be a smart ball player in what was called professional basketball in those days.
Was it like pulling teeth to win games?
Well, I was the youngest man on the team. I had 3 college captains playing for me, the captain of St. Francis, the captain of Columbia, and the captain of NYU. I arranged for them to practice against the original Celtics at the 28th Street gym, but only 2 or 3 would show up at a time. They were afraid that if they devoted too much time to basketball, they wouldn't pass their dental college studies.
So what kind of a record did you have there?
Well, I'll tell you this, for 3/4 of a game, we'd probably beat anybody in the country, but then they just died. They were never in shape.
You had the wrong drills.
My record was
So
whatever.
where did you go from there then?
From there, once again in the same neighborhood where I was handling this little team, the local high school, St. Michael's High School, came after me to coach there. And I signed up with St. Michael's and really coached there for a period of, I'd say 8 or 10 years. In the meanwhile, I was teaching physical education at Regis High School. And when St. Michael's managed to beat Regis a couple of times during the season, they wondered up there why I wasn't coaching Regis. And so for the next, I'd imagine 12 years, I coached 2 New York City Catholic high schools at the same time. St. Michael's and Regis for maybe 8 or 10 years, and then I switched over because it was more lucrative to Palm Memorial, where I coached for 4 or 5 years and where I was football coach also.
How'd you avoid playing each other?
Well, that question came up in the papers one time. The reporter asked me, we happened to be in the 32-team tournament, the Columbus Casey tournament in Brooklyn. And the question came up because we made the quarterfinals. Both teams made the quarterfinals. I said, well, if they meet in the finals, this was at the famous KC Hall. They had boxes all around. I said, if they meet one another, I'm going to sit up in that center box, smoke a cigar for the first time in my life, and lose a job.
When you came to Regis, that's your first affiliation with Jesuits.
That's right.
How did you get hired by Regis? Did you have a special affinity for the Jesuits, or did you just...
No, the man before me happened to be a friend of mine from Savage, and they were firing him, and they asked him to recommend somebody, and he recommended me.
Did he think he was doing them a favor? Now, when you coached, you had some great teams at Regis.
At Regis?
Yeah, I mean, these were great teams.
Oh, always, amazingly so, because as you know, Regis High School, to get in there, you have to be a young genius. And to stay in there, you had to be a middle-aged one, I guess. Because any time you flunked 2 subjects, you would drop from school. In those years, they had to have 4 years of Latin, 3 years of Greek, and 2 years of a foreign language, like French or Spanish or whatever.
And yet you wound up having a #1 team in the country?
When in 1948, they won 37 straight games. the famous Rooney twins, Barry Sullivan, Joe Breen, Mike Woods, and met St. Francis in the Garden. St. Francis was supposed to be the #1 high school team in the country, and Regis beat them by 5 points.
Now, this is 1948.
Went on from there to win 37 straight games, and finally their winning streak was ended in double overtime by a very good Columbia freshman team.
How about the tournament in Newport, Rhode Island?
Well, we were invited up to the Eastern States Championships in Newport, Rhode Island in 1944. And I made one of my usual mistakes and permitted the center, Jake O'Connell, to play a game of CYO basketball, which was for the city championship. He injured his knee very badly and didn't play up in tremendous rebounder, tremendous scorer. He didn't play up in Newport, and we lost 2 games by 1 point.
Does Jake have any children?
Each game. Yes, Jake has a beautiful daughter who is at St. Peter's College in an official capacity.
That wouldn't be Eileen Carter, would it?
That would be Eileen Carter.
Now, in '48, when you were up in Newport, you won the tournament?
And we won the tournament in 48 and 49. And the other years, we were invited every year but 46. We were invited 44, 40, every year but 45. We were invited in 44, 46, 47, 48, 49, and 50. And we're always in the finals. And won in 47 and 48.
Did it ever occur to you, or did you ever have this in the back of your mind, that you're going to be a college coach?
Not really. Of course, it's in the back of any coach's mind that someday you're going to make what you'd call advances. But that just came along. I had received offers from 3 or 4 of the Jesuit colleges to coach there, but at that time I had started my summer camp business and couldn't move out to St. Louis or any place else. And besides that, every Jesuit college except St. Louis was offering $4,000, and I was making more than that coaching at the time.
Well, when you went down to coach the North-South All-Stars in Murray, Kentucky,
yes,
didn't you have some kind of a meeting with a great coach down there who tried to get you into the college ranks?
No, they wanted me to coach. Murray State wanted me to coach. They called me annually for 4 or 5 years to try to get me down there and coach. But Ed Hickey, the famous Ed Hickey, coach of the famous St. Louis
Billikens,
but they had another name, the fingertip fast break team. And I talked to Ed Hickey down there, and when he left St. Louis, he evidently recommended me as a successor because St. Louis tried very hard to get me to go out there and coach.
Didn't you have a coach sneak in on one of your practices in Murray?
Yes, down in Murray. They brought us down a week ahead of time. And we had a week to practice, and they asked the coaches, well, do you want these scouts and so forth looking in your practice? So all the coaches agreed, no, nobody gets in. And one day I was there when the manager of the Murray State team, who was my manager of the North team down there, said, coaches, the colonel is up on the balcony. So I said, well, tell him to get the heck out of there, but this was impossible in Kentucky. And he stayed and watched our first part of the practice, and then we came down for a cool off in the dressing room, and I get this timid knock on the door, and in pops the colonel's head, and he said, hello, coach. Haven't seen you since we met up in New York. He never met me in New York. He was just a charmer, you could call him.
And we're talking about Adolph Rupp, right?
Adolph Rupp, the colonel.
Now, didn't he mention you to Murray also?
he recommended me to marry. Yes,
Now, you came to St. Peter's in 1950.
that's right.
Didn't some coach try to talk you out of it? Honey Russell again?
No,
Or
Honey
did he
Russell
warn you?
was partly responsible for me coming to St. Peter's. No, the people at Regis,
Father Perel.
the principal, and the principal said that I should take the Fordham job. But when he looked into it, Johnny Bach had the Fordham job for 3 weeks before they fired Bo Adams. So
And Bo was your partner.
when I said I thought I'd take the St. Peter's job, Father Perel said, well, that's a coach's graveyard. You don't want to go over there. But I came over and signed up, and when the starters came out, which was on June 15th in those days, the Jesuit starters, Father Perel was assigned to St. Peter's. And we had another very nice 7 years association.
When you came to St. Peter's, what kind of a basketball program did you think would ever become what it became? I mean, you were playing like Brooklyn College and Bayonne Naval Base.
Well, I didn't have that kind of foresight, but a fellow came along by the name of Fred Cranwell, and he insisted on booking a tougher schedule every year. And
yeah, but you had to play it.
pardon?
Now, you had to play that skill. Now,
That's right.
I remember 52, 53, you played Seton Hall, the #1 team in the country, NYU and Fordham, both top 10, and you lost by a total of 6 points. That was, I think people then started to realize what was in store for St. Peter's.
I think so. What I liked about that, the wonderful Father Jim Shanahan was coming from some sort of a meeting in California, happened to get off the train in Arizona or someplace, and picked up a sport page, and the headline was, "Little team from New Jersey loses to #1 and 2 teams by 3 points." And he said it was the proudest moment of his sporting experience.
How were you lured to St. Peter's? Who came after you? Who picked up the phone and called you?
No.
How'd that happen?
There used to be a tournament that St. Peter's ran called the Jesuit Tournament. And I would say very seldom did Regis not win it. Regis would win the tournament over here. They had a very loyal student body. They would get 4 abreast and march from the college down to through Journal Square with the permission of the cops and all the rest of it. So I was fairly well known as a high school coach at the time. And when Honey Russell told me the job was open, I told Honey that I said they offered me $400 to coach once. And Honey said, well, you go over there now because you can name your own price, which gave me a fair idea of what I should ask for coming into St. Peter's, and I was given it. And I wanted to continue teaching at Regis to have a fair salary, and they permitted me to do that. But after 2 years, Father Shanahan came. I happened to be in a hospital at the time. Father Shanahan came in to see me and said, let's stop this nonsense, Don. We'll make up the Regis salary and so forth, and you can just be with St. Peter's, which was fine by me.
Father Gus Grady was the athletic director.
Father Gus Grady was great. He was the last of the Jesuit athletic directors at that time, and he helped and guided me through my first year on the athletic director's end of it.
And then Father Shanahan actually was your boss.
Father Shanahan was the boss, and
you
I
dealt
was
directly-
answerable only to the boss.
How long did that last?
It lasted quite a while, but then they started this business of committees and so forth, so instead of having one man to answer to, I had 4 or 5, and it didn't work out too well.
No, in the beginning we played in the NAIA tournament.
That's right.
Did well. And I guess it was 1956 or 57 was our first NIT.
That's right. 57 was the first NIT, We went out to Kansas, representing the Manhattan and
District
New York,
31.
New Jersey area 2 or 3 times in the first few years.
The NIT was better? The NIT was better?
Oh my goodness, the NIT was at that time the most prestigious tournament in the country, more so than the NCAA.
Now, the first game was against Dayton, and that was one of the great games in the NIT. Now, we lost it. And then we beat Marshall and went in 68. Do you put the Dayton and the Marshall game in the same class, even though we won one, lost one?
No, we had a hard job. I think we were in it 3 or 4 times before we won a game. 3 times.
No, I think Dayton we lost
57, 58.
Lost to St. Joseph's, lost to Southern Illinois 3 times.
Yeah.
And then you surprised everyone.
Yeah.
What was the greatest moment in the tournaments? I'm probably talking about the Duke game.
You're talking about the Duke game?
Would you call that your greatest?
Well, some reporters said that the game was over before 5 minutes was up because St. Peter's jumped into the league, got 15, 20 points ahead and stayed ahead. And in the Marshall game itself, of course, was a tie score at the end of the regulation game, at the end of the first overtime period, and we actually won the game in the second overtime period.
Now, at halftime of Marshall, we were trailing big, I think. We were trailing at the halftime of Marshall.
I believe we were, yes.
It was more than 10 points.
That's so.
And I think we tied the game up within 2 minutes.
Yeah. And
that was a very exciting game.
Yeah, Marshall was a really good ball club in those years.
How about Dick Bubas? You got any good Dick Bubas recollections?
Well,
the coach of Duke?
My recollections of Dick Bubas are sort of secondhand because this is a story told by one of the reporters. Duke was the favorite to win the tournament, as they should have been. They were ranked as high as 3rd in the country that year. And the reporter supposedly said to Vic, "What do you think of St. Peter's?" And Bubas said, "St. Peter's? What is that, a church?" And when the game was over, we won by 29 points. The score, I think, was 100-71. The same reporter asked Bubas, "So what do you think of St. Peter's now?" And Bubas said, "Damn fast church."
Now, you played Duke again 2 years later.
Yes, we played them in the
tournament, the Christmas tournament.
Holiday tournament, festival, I guess they called it, holiday tournament.
Did they get even?
No, they didn't get even. We beat them by 3 or 4. We took it easy on them this time.
Was it still a fast church? Like, people ask who your greatest players were, and I don't think that's fair. In the 50s, when you got here, we had Bernie Cicerelli and Heitman and Jacob Bowski.
Not when I got here. They came.
Well, that was the
second year. We had Woody Boyle, who had played for me at Regis. Tommy Smith, who was a great ball player, played later on for the Knickerbockers and became mayor of Jersey City. Tommy was a great, great player.
But that team with Cicerelli and Heitman,
well,
Jacob Bowski, and then coming into the 50s when you played Dayton.
That came naturally. A man by the name of Bob Jacobowski, who was the decathlon man in track and could jump halfway over the basket, was our 6'2" center. And Heitman was a tremendous shot. Cicerelli was the captain and floor leader of the team. Underdunk was the other backcourt man. Oh, I've missed somebody.
Ronnie Burke.
Ronnie Burke was a great ball player for us.
Donnie O'Rourke.
O'Rourke was great as long as he stayed in school.
Okay. Now that's one team. Now you go into the 50s, you have Pepadulli and Hank Morano and Banis and Gallagher and Donnie, your son, and Jay Olmsted. And
Right.
That's another good team. And then you come into the 60s and you have Laurie and Webster, O'Day and Grant, McMahon and Leckie and those kids.
Yeah.
Now, what would happen if those teams played each other? Now, you had St. Michael's and Regis where you would sit in the balcony and smoke a cigar. How would you handle these?
Oh, you're talking about how many years between? 10 years
10,
between?
10.
I bet on the young team. The younger
So, otherwise,
team.
which was your greatest team?
Well, undoubtedly, the 68 team was probably the greatest St. Peter's team, although I thought we had good clubs all along. Like you said before, the Cicerelli, Heitman, Jacobowski team lost by 6 points to 3 of the leading teams in the country.
Who on those teams could have made the squad in '68?
Well,
Who would you cut?
that's a tough question. Pepper Dooley was one of the most popular players in the country, I think, at the time. He was a young magician with the ball. And of course, Pepper was about 5'8" and 128 pounds or something like that, but he was a young marvel. A great, great ball player.
And then you had in Pepper. Could Bernie have played on any of those teams?
I think Bernie could have played on any team because Bernie was a solid scorer, solid leader, play his head off for you in the ball game.
What do you think the greatest ingredient was in all your teams? They all seem to have something. I call it chemistry. That they all had that great chemistry. You functioned as a team.
It was our idea, of course, to be a team. And the type of ball I played didn't permit, and I didn't permit, any ball hog from spoiling teamwork and so forth. And we worked on that assumption. I think it worked out very well.
Now, the game of basketball changes over from era to era. Is it? It's the same game.
Basketball has changed so much that I'm wondering what it's going to come to. If I, for instance, was all of a sudden the college basketball czar, the first thing I would do would be to eliminate any rule that they put forward in the last 10 years.
That's a good suggestion. How would your '68 team do if you had them right now, with some of the teams you've seen now?
Well, I think they would be one of the outstanding teams in the country. I have not seen too much of good basketball team lately in any of the college clubs. Where we used to work for the play to throw a man free with an easy layup under the basket or whatever, now it seems to me they pass the ball around till somebody gets a three-point shot. This, to me, is not the type of basketball that we played.
What you've watched when you left in 1972, I guess. What's your opinion of St. Peter's basketball from that time till now? What goes through your mind as you watch the years go by?
Fred, I don't dare say.
Yes, you do.
No, I don't.
Because you don't, I will.
Actually, it's obvious that the type of basketball has deteriorated, that the schedule has deteriorated, and this is a strange thing to me because in my day, all we had to give was 5 academic scholarships, and you had to pass the entrance exam to qualify for those scholarships. And now they have boarding, and they bring in, well, we've had players from all over the country, like out in Seattle, we had a player a year or so ago. Down in Florida, last year, the little boy with the ponytail. They had a boy from Holland on the team last year, and several other boy from Italy at one time, and so forth. My foreigners used to come from Brooklyn.
That's where you came from. I look at St. Peter in 1972. and since you left, they replaced coaches, and I think the mistake they made is they've never tried to replace Don Kennedy. They're just bringing in generic coaches rather than trying to bring in a tradition.
Well, the coaches, in my opinion, all did fairly well, and the one coach I objected to was the man who, if he deliberately tried to ruin the St. Peter's style of basketball, he succeeded. We went from, and ruined the crowd, incidentally, who loved the fast break type game, the action type game. He went to the Princeton type of basketball where they'd get 2 points ahead and try to freeze the ball for the rest of the game. That, to me, was an abrupt change in St. Peter's style of basketball. So
actually, a tradition of basketball at St. Peter's ended 20 years ago, where we now have a basketball program, but we no longer have a basketball tradition.
There are more than several faithful rooters from our day still coming, hoping to see improvement in St. Peter's basketball.
Well, we have memories.
Yeah.
Harry Byrne, Judge Byrne, comes to every game now. Do you remember Harry as a manager?
Well, Harry was a manager, I guess, for 4 years. He was assistant manager for the first couple of years. His father, who took care of Harry. Harry, as you know, was quite handicapped in those years. His father came to me when Harry was graduating from St. Peter's Prep and asked me to give him a job in the basketball program, which I was happy to do, and it worked out very well. Harry happened to be the #1 man in his graduating class and went to New York law, where he was #1 for the 3 years he studied law.
In the 23 years you were here, you worked with many Jesuits. Who were some of the Jesuits that you'll never forget?
Well, I talked about Father Gus Grady.
Father Shanahan.
And then we had other men who was like Arthur Clark and so forth, who were assistants. But Father Perel was the main Jesuit in my time here, and my time at Regis. And Father Bob O'Connell followed Father Perel and stayed on as athletic moderator for 7 or 8 years.
Didn't you have a moderator who lasted 3 hours?
Yes, I can almost recall the name, but when I asked him why he had resigned, he said, "Too much Jesuit influence," which I didn't understand.
And in those days, we always had a Jesuit involved.
Oh yes, we had a Jesuit who was called the moderator of athletics.
How about Father Haggerty?
Father Haggerty had been a great athlete at Brooklyn Prep. He had a nickname.
Jiggs.
Huh?
Jiggs. Jiggs.
Jiggs Haggerty,
Jiggs
right.
Haggerty, yeah.
But by the time he became athletic moderator, he wasn't as active anymore, but he certainly was interested in basketball.
Now, you had a moderator who you knew when you were at Regis and he was at the Prep, Father Joe McAvoy. How did that work out?
It didn't work out very well at all because, the Prep was opening a new gym about, I would say, 1949 or so. And Regis was picked to open the gym against St. Peter's Prep, and I thought for 2 reasons, because Regis was rather prominent, but because they knew that the famous Rooney twins and the rest of that crowd had graduated. And so we opened their new gym and gave them a terrific beating, and Father McAvoy never forgave me.
Now, he came down from Canisius when you were here.
He came down from Canisius, and
Wasn't there like some rumors he was spreading?
well, he was going to fire me.
Well, how did that work out?
Well, he left my office in a hurry. And he didn't have the power to fire. He just was.
Then you had some great assistant coaches, Bernie O'Keefe.
Oh, yes. Bernie, who was a great friend of mine and a great basketball coach, and unfortunately died what I would call an early death. I think he was 54 years old when he died of a heart condition. He died at the end of his 2 years as head coach of the college.
I think Bernie had 2 years, had a great recruiting year, and someone else enjoyed the fruits of his labor.
Yeah.
How about Tom Sessa? What do you remember about Tom Sessa?
Tom Sessa was one of the greatest St. Peter's people there ever were. Tom went to St. Peter's Prep and had quite a history down there, and then he came up to the college and ended up in charge of the cafeteria, and from that he was made the first lay vice president of St. Peter's College.
And then he wound up going to Florida.
Well, he went to Florida, and I think a little bit through knowing the basketball situation, he became the vice president of
Is it Biscayne or St. Leo's? Or
Biscayne College, and was very active. He put his mother and father in charge of the cafeteria, and he made great friends with the football.
The Miami Dolphins.
The Miami Dolphins, and their famous original coach,
Don Shula.
Shula. He and Tom were great friends, and unfortunately Tom died a fairly early death too. Tom had been in the, he was a major in the Marine Air Force, and he had an accident coming onto a carrier. He had an accident going off a carrier. And he actually had what you could call a plate in his head. And he eventually died from the head condition brought on by this.
How about Nick Tafero?
Nick Tafero was famous as the coach of St. Peter's Prep and St. Peter's College. He was a great, one of our fond memories. Nick Tafero. He was a great trainer and a great companion, great guy.
Another great companion who traveled with us on many a trip was Marty Sinatra.
Oh yes, Marty. We took him on a trip to Florida one time, and we set up in a motel, and he made arrangements to do all the cooking. He wouldn't let us go out to dinner until maybe the Saturday last day we were staying around. I insisted upon taking the older members of the group out to a place in Clearwater Beach called the Pelican.
And we couldn't get a table. I think Marty got us the table by pulling his wallet out.
No, I don't recall that, but Marty was all right. He liked the Pelican, incidentally.
And I'm thinking other people that you made great friends with parents too.
Yes.
Who are still great friends.
That's exactly it. We had some wonderful friends with the parents of people like Cicerelli and
O'Day.
Pete O'Day and so forth.
I see St. Peter's as a family rather than as an institution in ways like that.
Well, they were in that sense.
When did Father Yanatelli come along?
I don't know exactly when he came along. He came over here and made quite a name for himself. I always thought Father's main object in life was to be well liked. And for instance, maybe I'm making further enemies saying this, But as athletic director, the game of football was a real headache. It was costing me like $60,000 a year off my budget, no income, and I managed to eliminate football. And some of the football enthusiasts got together 500 signatures and brought them up to Father Yanatelli, and Father Yanatelli continued football, which I'm happy to say today is going a lot better than it did under Don Kennedy.
Another one of the people you dealt with was Marty Quirk, your secretary.
Oh, when I spoke before the Jersey athletic directors a month or so ago, I recommended that if you want to be a good athletic director, get yourself a great secretary. And that's what Marty Quirk was. A really great secretary. She could do all the work. She did mostly part of my work and handled everybody with great manners, or whatever you'd call it. She was a tremendous lady.
Now, school was different in those days. We closed up during the summer, and you had a summer camp.
Yes, I had a summer camp. I went into the summer camp business in 1937 and ended up with a very large, one of the largest of the Catholic camps out in East Hampton. We called it Camp St Regis. And I bought that property in 1944 and sold it in 1983, and in the meanwhile it was a marvelous place. It was called one of the 10 most beautiful camps in America.
Now, you had the basketball camp there too. Some famous basketball people worked for you.
Well, yes. Ed Conlon, who was the star of Fordham, the time that they beat us by a couple of points, was out there.
Jack Powers?
Jack Powers worked for me for at least 5 or 6 years, and he was in charge basically of the basketball portion of the camp. And Connie Simmons, who played with the Knickerbockers, worked for me there for a while. Ed Danowski, one of the greatest football players I thought ever was. He was the original quarterback for the football Giants and built up a great name for himself there, and eventually became football coach at Fordham.
You have this poem you recite.
Pardon?
You recite a poem about what happens to basketball coaches. Don't you? What was the poem about?
Well, it's a poem that I don't even know where it came from, but I liked it, and it can be applied to other people besides basketball coaches. Do you want me to try to recall
I'd like
the
to
poem?
hear it.
The man stood at the pearly gates, his face was scarred and old, for he had come to learn his fate for admission to the fold. What have you done, St. Peter said, to gain admission here? A basketball coach, I bet he said, for many and many a year. The pearly gates swung open wide. St. Peter rang the bell. Come in and choose your harp, he said. You've had your share of hell.
One set of people we haven't discussed were referees. Now, you have a bad, an unfair reputation at times that you were tough on referees, but they were some of your better friends.
Well, some of them were my good friends and on to this day. However, they were very proud in those days of saying that there are no dishonest referees. I could give some outstanding examples of where they were the worst referees I have ever known in my life, both high school and college.
There's one story on referees, and it involves a person who stayed on here at the college as a teacher who just retired, Vinny Flaherty. Now, do you remember going out to Dayton the year after the NIT?
Well, that had nothing to do with referees.
Well, didn't Vinny get on the radio and...
Yeah, he got on the radio.
Now, did that get you in trouble?
You bet it got me in trouble.
Tell us what happened.
We lost to Dayton, and they had to have the most dishonest referees in the world. They called 4 technicals in the last minute, And one of them was called on me for asking what the technical was for. I asked, what's that technical for? He said, well, that's another one on you for asking. They didn't put it that way. And then the rival coach at the time,
Tom Blackburn.
Bob Blackburn. Tom Blackburn. A great reputation as a coach, and really deserved it. He had great teams. But he also had a radio and television program. No, he had a radio program. But when we got into the motel, when we came to the game, before the game, Vinny, who was our manager, taking a look at the afternoon sports program, said, hey, I was in the Marines with that guy, or whatever it was. And he called up and was invited down to the man's program that night. And Vinny never revealed the fact that he wasn't the coach, so everybody took it for granted he was the coach. And the fellow said, well, fine, what do you think of losing today? And Vinny said, we were jobbed. And when I got back to St. Peter's, I was up on the carpet and wanted to know why I said it, and made practically every paper in the country. And I had to explain that I didn't say it, Vinny said it.
You remember going to Florida, and one of the first times we went, and we came back and we had played a game at Wagner, I think it was, and the crowd started yelling, Coach uses Mantan.
No, I don't remember that, Fred.
Because I think that's when we first started making those trips, and we all came back with a little bit of a sunburn.
I think we were one of the first of the teams to start flying, and particularly to Florida and so forth.
You want to tell us about Father O'Connell in Jacksonville with the referee?
Oh, my Lord. Well, we were playing Tampa, right?
Yes.
It wasn't Jacksonville. We were playing Tampa.
Correct.
And the coach very bluntly said to Bunny and I when we were talking at him in the afternoon before the game, and he talked about some referee. He said, why, I wouldn't have that guy back here as a referee. We lost. In other words, if you were the referee and you refereed for Tampa and Tampa lost, you didn't get any more jobs. Well, before the game started, the referees came on the floor, and the one man came over to us and put on a great show with the fact that he was from Jersey and knew about us and so forth. And we felt, well, at least we might have a partial friend on the floor anyway. And he proceeded to give the game to Tampa. I don't know what we lost by, a few points. And when the game was over, he came over with a smile, and Father O'Connell, who was a very mild-mannered man, in fact, but he's a big, tall man, and he had been a pretty good athlete himself. This referee came over, and in effect, he said, oh, how'd I do, or whatever. Father O'Connell didn't say anything, but in those days, the referees wore those little bow ties with they had a rubber band on them, and he just took that tie out about 10 inches, let it snap, and he said, you're a goddamn thief. Pardon the French, but that's what he said.
How about, remember Father O'Connell and Sophie Tucker?
Oh, well, we were playing
New Orleans.
No, we were playing
Loyola
in New Orleans. We were playing on the very peculiar basketball court. The people in the front row were looking at all you could see was their heads, and this court was up here. But anyway, that's another story. But we lost. And going back to the hotel, the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans, it was raining a little bit, so I dropped Father O'Connell off, and I said, I'll park the car across the street, and I'll be right in. By the time I got in there, he came, I saw him coming down this huge foyer, I guess you'd call it, a Roosevelt. It extended from street to street. And he had the most garishly dressed woman I ever saw in my life. Red and spangles and so forth. And I'm like, Lord, what's got a hold of Father O'Connell? And he came up and he said to me, Don, I would like you to meet Sophie Tucker. And it was. And we went, we were invited in to see her show that night and so forth. And the only thing I remember is that some husband got mad at Fred Cranwell for speaking to his wife.
I remember Sophie said, you want to save money and you want to eat somewhere else. He said, we can't go in here. We have a priest. Whatever the girls take their clothes off. And Sophie said, you can tell everybody he's a blind priest.
Memories.
For Alan's sake, you remember the sitting on a runway at Newark Airport trying to get up to St. Bonaventure?
Oh, yes. We took the blame for that, but what could we do? We were snowed in.
We were supposed to play St. Bonaventure. Yeah. We couldn't get up there. And then they wanted us to play the game at the end of the year, but was the NIT?
Yeah.
Wanted neither team to play each other.
They raised a little heck with us, but just wasn't possible.
You have questions, Alan?
Yeah, I have a few.
Good. Your turn.
Want to trade places?
Sure.
Do you have any more?
Oh, I'll listen to what.
Awesome. I mean,
I'll see what you say.
Okay, very good. How you doing, Mr. Kennedy?
How
You're
are
doing
you?
a great job.
I'm among friends.
That's right.
What do you think?
I'm not as good as Fred, but I'll give it a shot. Okay, Mr. Kennedy, can you tell me about how you used to conduct practices? What was your usual routine or regimen that you put players through?
Well, the team came in until gradually everybody was there, and then practice started officially. And ordinarily, we would start with passing and situations related to passing, and then go into layup drill. And I remember we would have a layup drill and what I called a long layup, about 6 feet off the basket, where you were supposed to be able to make that shot too. And the one thing I emphasized, and I think it was a general fault in all basketball players, including myself, I think, to go up in a layup, and you're going to lay the ball off the board and let it go through the basket, but you're looking at the basket. You're not looking at what you're trying to, where you're trying to get the ball. So I tried to get them to get that idea. If you're going up for a layup, look at the spot you're trying to lay it up against. And fundamental questions like that. Then we went into when we finished the layup drill, we went into what I call the clock drill, long shots, where there were 6 spots on the floor, what would amount to the 3-second shot now. And in order to get from one spot to the other, you had to make that shot. Sometimes they were there pretty long, but they went around and then came back, and we designated the first guy to come back as the winner. But that was our set shooting practice, and I insisted upon how they handled the ball, what they aimed at, the body position, particularly the feet, and the follow through and so forth. In other words, if they didn't do it my way, they'd better be pretty good shots.
Okay, what was your teaching or coaching philosophy overall? What did you try to instill in the players that you coached?
What?
Your teaching or coaching philosophy. What did you try to instill in your players to try to get the best out of them?
I've mentioned fundamentals before, and teamwork, of course. You know, and sometimes you'd have a problem with somebody didn't get along with the rest of them. You try to straighten that out, and I think we were fairly successful at that. We had 1 or 2 instances where somebody wouldn't get along with the the rest of the team, and I'd try to straighten it out.
Okay, you played many games in the Jersey City Armory. Can you tell me your impressions of a game at the Armory? What kind of sights, sounds do you remember from a experience?
What kind of what?
Sights, sounds, noises, experiences from a game at the
still
Armory.
didn't get you.
Well, say you're at the Armory during a basketball game. What kind of experience was it? Can you describe what the scene was like?
The game?
Yeah, at the Jersey
Well,
City Armory.
of course, the Armory had one of the best courts, I guess, in basketball, because we made it, I set it up and made it to the official distances and so forth, and there was nothing in that Armory to interfere with good basketball. Like there was no low ceiling or anything like that, and the crowd wasn't too close. They were well away from the floor, and I thought that you could play as good a game in the Armory as you could play anywhere. It was I can't think of any drawbacks to playing at the Army for either the visitors or ourselves.
What were some of the other more interesting road gyms that you played at? Do you recall any place that was very hostile towards St. Peter's?
Yes, quite a few, I guess.
Please elaborate.
There was one at Siena, which had a very rabid crowd, which almost ended up with several of us going to jail. It was broke up in an argument with the fans and the referees at the end of the ball game. Siena was one. Your place was a little bit against us, and
Seton Hall was always a tough place to go.
Well, Seton Hall was they finally admitted that St. Peter's was a worthy opponent. At first, the idea was that if you went to play Seton Hall, you had to lose by 30 points. But we managed to correct that in a hurry. And Seton Hall, I thought, was a great opponent. Always fair as they could be, and I never knew of a referee that I would think of as being affected by Seton Hall, except possibly by the fact that, well, this is this great Seton Hall playing this little college from Jersey City and so forth. I never felt Seton Hall was a hard place to play. It was a rabid place, but we brought our own crowd, and they were pretty rabid too, you know.
How about Scranton?
Oh, Scranton. Scranton was determined to knock hell out of us one time, and I asked for police protection, and they wouldn't get it after beating up on us, including Bernie Arcane got kicked that time. So I took the team off the floor and wouldn't go back to Scranton anymore.
Did you do that at Delaware State also?
And incidentally, when I was a player, I used to play, sometimes we'd play in a game at Scranton where the visiting team had to be escorted out to their bus or their cars by the police. It was a pretty rabid place to play.
What happened at Delaware State?
What was it anyway? I can't.
They never finished the game there.
No.
Remember they had the windows open in the locker rooms, and the gym was like 800 degrees, and the referees.
Well, we got into some sort of an argument.
And there was a technical foul, and they wanted you to take the team more. I don't know. They threatened to forfeit the game if you didn't take a player off, and we went home.
I don't remember that one.
That's not one of my most vivid memories, Fred.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did you play a tie game with Manhattan?
No, that was the year before I came.
I was just going to ask, were there any other big rivalries or any other memorable games that you, with other area schools that you used to?
Well, Manhattan was always a great rival, as was Iona and St. Francis. And I recall one Manhattan game, and they had just won the holiday tournament. They came over to play us at the Armory, and we beat them on a last-second shot by Bill Smith, who may still be the leading scorer in St. Peter's history, at least as far as three-year ball players are concerned.
Okay, among opposing players, who were some of the greatest players that ever played against St. Peter's, and what made them so?
Against St. Peter's?
Against St. Peter's, yeah. Like individual performers.
Well, in the first year, one of the real good games we had was up at Siena. We ended a 9-year winning streak on their home floor. And the star of the team was Billy Harrell, who became the shortstop for the Cleveland Indians and played out there for years. A great athlete. And in setting up before the game, Harrell was maybe 6 feet tall. I put Jacobowski on him. Bob Jacobowski, our 6'2" center who could leap like a deer and so forth. And Jake held him well enough for us to beat them rather handily.
Calvin Murphy?
Oh, Calvin Murphy, who got to be a great friend of mine. Calvin Murphy came into our armory at the first time when he was a sophomore and scored 52 points against us, and we lost by 2 points, I guess. And the following year, we went up to the Buffalo Auditorium and played Calvin, and I put a boxing one on him. Sammy DiPiano played him. Sammy's about the same size and played him, and we beat them up there. And the following year, they came back down to the Jersey City Armory, and we beat them down here. So 2 out of the 3 years that Murphy played with them. Do you know who Murphy was?
Oh, yeah.
He played 9 years of professional basketball, and he was 5'9" tall.
In the Rockets, yes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
His son now plays for Niagara.
That's right.
Yeah, Calvin Murphy Jr.
He wouldn't take the same number out of respect for his father.
Pardon?
He didn't take number 23, was it?
23.
23. Out of respect. I think it was 30. He wears 32 now.
How would you rate Walter Dukes at Seton Hall?
Well, Walter Dukes was the first of the real big men. And once again, I put Jacobowski on him, but Jake fronted him this time. And they'd try to pass the ball high into Dukes, and Jake would go way up the air and steal the ball. And of course, we had our weak side man draw her off in case the ball got back, and he would play inside Duke. So then we had Duke playing front and back. And I think Duke's wasn't he limited to 2 baskets?
He didn't score a lot.
No, I think he got 2 baskets in that game. That's all he got.
How about Walt Frazier?
Oh, Frazier was a great basketball player. Nobody wanted to play the Saluki, so they made us play them. And they murdered us. And there was another backcourt man who played as much pro ball as Frazier, but he played at Baltimore, I think, not around the New York area. And of course, the Salukis walked through the whole tournament. And they were only a college, and I got the impression that somebody had gotten together a pretty good pro-type ball club.
How about playing in I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, because the next year, we did to Duke what the Salukis had done to us, so the previous year.
Well, elaborating on what Fred said and what you said, can you give me more detail about the Run Baby Run? How did the nickname come about, and can you tell me about the drive towards the
Well, the Run Baby Run was just a phrase. They were supposed to run. Well, there was no difference in the run, baby, run idea and what they were supposed to do regularly. It's just that it was an important ball game, and that had been put on the blackboard or whatever it was by Tom Schwester, who was quite a ball player and never really reached his potential with us. But I think for a while he held the single game high scoring. He tied Webster's record. Was that it, Fred?
He scored well in the 50s.
Huh?
He scored, I think, 56 against Manhattan.
No, he tied or beat Webster by a point, maybe. He either tied Webster or beat him by a point. In the game against Manhattan, we scored Manhattan was invited to the NIT, and we scored 137 points on them. Beat the devil out of them.
You played Artis Gilmore at Jacksonville, I believe.
Yeah, Gilmore was one of the real big ball players of his time.
How about JoJo White at Kansas?
Well, JoJo White was one of the greatest ball players I think ever lived. He was a great ball player and played ball for many years in pro and so forth.
And down at Miami, you played Rick Barry.
Yeah, we played Rick Barry down there.
And George played in that game.
George played, and we were about 5 or 6 points ahead of Miami in the first half. When George came down and he took a shot, and you made that shot. Huh?
Yes.
He took a shot away off to the left, went off the backboard and in, but somebody hit him, and he went skidding along, and the players sat on benches at the end of the court, and he knocked his head against the thing and didn't get back in the game. Did you have stitches at that time?
No, they did a butterfly, what do they call it?
Huh?
They did a quick stitch.
Oh, they did the, what do you call it, the butterfly, huh?
Yeah.
Well, then after he was knocked out, Miami beat us fairly easily. I don't remember what they beat us by, but before that, I thought that we had a good chance of beating them.
When we played NYU, they had some pretty good players.
Oh,
Zach
yeah.
Sanders play against us?
Well, he played in a practice game against us.
How
I
about
don't know.
Cal Ramsey?
I think Ramsey played against. I don't recall the individuals.
Okay, Coach. Can you tell me about the, if you remember back that far, the 1952-1953 season? How did you feel being invited to the NAIA tournament, and what was involved with that?
Well, we had to, first of all, win the local NAIA tournament over here. St. Francis College was in it, Manhattan, Fairleigh Dickinson, ourselves. It ended up a game between Fairleigh Dickinson and ourselves. And at the end of the first half, they had a huge church bell. It weighed half a ton or more that they brought up into the stands. This game was held at Dickinson High School. And when Fairleigh would score, that bell would go bong. Felt the whole building shake. And so we were behind by 6, 7 points at the half, and Father Perel used to like to come in and listen to me rave a little bit, and I didn't let him come in because I thought I'd be using some choice words, and the main gist of which was to tell him what to do with the bell. And we went out and won handily, and that gave us the right to go to Kansas City. Fairleigh had a great team. Fairleigh has not had as good a team as that since. That was the first team they ever had. They got together Glasgow, the great soccer player, and Levinson, and they had a real good ball club.
Jeff from Ashford?
I wanted to ask you about Dr. Robbins. some of your recollections of Doc Robbins, and you probably had the first women doctor.
Well, yes, all these things, just happened. They didn't. We didn't mean them to happen. But Doc Robbins was a great friend of Tom Sessa's wife, Nellie, and she showed up at several of our ball games. And at this particular ball game, some Manhattan ball player got in the way of a St. Peter's elbow and had a very bad cut on his scalp. And during the half, she stitched the boy up, and he came back on the floor and played a pretty good game. And then Doc started to come in and sit on the bench, and then she got serious about wanting to be a great trainer, which was peculiar because she was one of the best-known chest authorities, surgeons in the country. But she actually went up to Rhode Island University and took summer courses in training and so forth to be our trainer, and then was with us for many years.
You remember the story of the chiropractor?
Yeah, I remember the story of the chiropractor. There was a student in school who had played for one of the local schools in football and so forth, and his father was a chiropractor, and his father had done a few jobs for them, and came to me before the game, and he said, "I noticed you're in a losing slump." Yes, we lost 3 games in a row, and we were playing American University in the Armory. And he said, "I think I can help your boys." He said, "Would you mind if I gave them a little loosening up and so forth before the game?" I said, "No, go ahead." And I was going to say stupidly, but it was honestly. I gave credit to the fact that the chiropractor had worked on our club and so forth, and it was printed in the papers. And the day after it was printed, every dentist and every doctor who ever got out of St. Peter's College was calling up and demanding I be fired for talking one of the... So once again, I had to come up to the authorities, and they explained, "Well, it's all right, Don, but don't do it again."
Okay, I have a question. How about the student body? How would you perceive students and how they supported the team, pep rallies, how they welcomed you back from road trips? What was your impression of the student body?
Well, of course, this is not the type of school where you go away and come back and come put up in a dormitory. It may be now, but not in our day. We got off the plane, everybody went his own way. After we come back here, there was no real work, but the student body was great. They were very supportive of the basketball team, and were all along. And there are people still, like I said before, people still coming to watch St. Peter's play that were in the student body at that time. I always thought they were really great followers of the five. Follow the five.
How about, what was I going to ask? Oh, how about integration, like African-American players on the team? Did you have any problems maybe in Washington, D.C. or southern cities playing against St. Peter's?
Yes, we did. We had a wonderful fellow on the ball club. His name was
Teddy Edwards.
Huh?
Ted Edwards?
No.
Eddie Scott?
Ed Scott. We would go down and play in the Baltimore or Washington area, and the kids would walk into a cafeteria and have Ed Scott with them, and they were told, "We don't serve those in here." So they would go someplace else and buy enough hamburgers and so forth and go back up to the room and eat, and they were very supportive of Ed Scott. Ed was a great ball player, and he also was one of the leading thespians in school. They used to kid about him. One play, he said, what did he say? Me, so forth, whatever he was, whatever he was supposed to be. But I never had any trouble other than that. At the later years, that changed. And nobody would dare. But there was only one hotel would put us up in Baltimore. It was called the American Hotel, too.
Didn't we have a problem in Kansas City? Did they segregate the black players?
Not that I recall.
The NAIA.
Not that I recall. We didn't have any black players on it.
You had Ron Burke, Ted Edwards.
Yeah, well, Ted was quite the gentleman. He became a lawyer, did he? Whatever. Ted wasn't with us for more than a year or two. He was one of these fellas had been off in the Army and so forth, and come back and decided he had another couple of years of college. And Ted played with us, but Ted somehow or other was never one of the regulars. He was a good ball player, but he never really came along to the point where he would be considered one of our great ball players.
You mentioned recruiting, and Brooklyn was a hot spot for talent. How about New Jersey and other exotic locales where you landed some players for your teams?
Well, I never recruited because I had nothing to recruit with. You take a great ball player like Billy Raftery or somebody like that, and you go up and say, how would you like to go to a tough Jesuit school where you have to have a 75 average to even get into the place and so forth, as against you being invited to go to, well, he went to La Salle, where they would put him up and give him trips down there, and there were other schools who would give the kid a car and everything else. And all I had to offer against that was, as I said, a tough program and so forth. And I never tried, but Bernie Arkeen was responsible for any recruiting we did. He talked some good ball players into coming here, and some of the good ball players talked other ball players into coming. That's the recruiting we did. We could not recruit. We didn't have anything to recruit with. Now I understand they have boarding for their players and full expenses and all the rest of it.
You've always had a history of walk-ons. Some walk-ons became good ball players.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You taught them.
Hmm?
You taught them.
Well, some of them they take like Tommy McMahon. Tom McMahon played on Seton Hall Prep, and when it came time to go to college, he decided he didn't want to go to Seton Hall. He came to St. Peter's paying his own way. And after a certain fellow who was here named him super sub, he got his scholarship, and I guess Tommy had a scholarship for at least 3 years. Freddie named him super sub, gave him a lot of publicity, and he turned out to be a great ball player. You know, the time we're talking about, he was one of the starters at the Duke game and so forth.
I know this is a tough question, and Fred touched upon it. Who are some of your greatest players, and what made them thus? If it's too tough a question, you don't have to ask that. Playing favorites and whatnot.
Well, I could go up the line and pick out the outstanding ones, and I never considered one the greatest. I thought Tommy Smith, who would go through that wall if I asked him to, was great.
Okay, how about some, I'm sorry.
And I mentioned players like Bernie Cicerelli and Bob Jacobowski, Billy Heitman, Dick Underdunk, and so forth. And then we went on to the first team that played in the NIT, and Pepper Dooley and Joe Banas, who just died. was the center, and Hank Morano was a great scorer, probably the top scorer. And Hank coached Emerson High School for many years after that. And he should have been the coach of St. Peter's College.
Well, Coach, I only have a few more, and then Fred can take it from wherever. I know, and you've been patient. I appreciate that. Go for just a second. Hey, Robert. Can you change the tape? Okay. Okay, you mentioned the Duke game. That is like the ultimate game. But do you recall any other regular season games throughout your career that stand out in your mind, and which were great victories? And could you elaborate on what made them so great?
Well, in high school, the year we played St. Francis when they were #1 team in the country and beat them, that had to be an outstanding game for any high school coach, you know. And then any Seton Hall game, you could say, was an outstanding game. And after a while, we had our rivals we wanted to beat, but if you would compare the schedule for the first couple of years to what we were playing in '68, let's say, we ended up, we wouldn't play anybody we thought was a pushover. We wanted to have a good schedule, draw a good crowd, which we did. We drew crowds at our Armory that'll never be equal, you know.
How about the night we played LIU in 1968?
Oh, well, that was actually, it was to be, the winner was to be invited to the NIT, and we knew it, and we won. But wasn't it Johnny Bach?
Johnny Bach showed up.
Johnny Bach came over as representing the Metropolitan Intercollegiate Association that runs the NIT. And at the end, we beat LIU. If I'm not mistaken, isn't that the game that Joe...
LIU was undefeated that night. And I think didn't Johnny Bach come down at halftime and invite both teams to the tournament?
After the game anyway, he
I think
did.
it was at halftime.
Was it halftime?
Because we came up to start the second half, and Damalagia was going to make the announcement that both teams were invited. And he got on the mic and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen," and that was all he had to say. And the place went crazy.
Yeah.
And our players were hugging their players, and we went on and we handed them their first loss at the
But
season.
isn't that the game that Joe, you know, the fellow who taught at Regis for a while now, he's a house mother, he calls himself?
Joe Replica.
Joe Replica. Isn't that the game he won?
I don't think so. Joe wasn't on that.
Well, that was an LIU game that Replica won. We were behind 4 points with 7 seconds to play. Tied the score and won in the overtime by 9 points or something like that. And Replica had made, well, we set up a play, a split, you'd call it, or we had the ball out of bounds. And whatever happened, he was supposed to give it to the guy who cleared. Nobody cleared, so he took the shot and the winner. Now we're 2 behind, and they've got the ball out of bounds. And we're playing them, and somehow the ball went off somebody's hand. One of our guys managed to get just a tip on the ball. And it went outside, so going outside, one of his players tried to catch it and couldn't handle it because it had been, now it's our ball outside again. So they throw the ball into Replica again. He drops the damn thing. He picked it up and threw it in the basket. The score is tied. In the overtime, we won with a fair amount of ease.
What was the game where you were behind like 7 points, I think it was. 21 seconds to go.
And Steve Day.
Steve Day and Kenny Grant, I think.
Yeah. And they were screaming out, "The little fat kid beat us, the little fat kid beat us." That's Steve Day.
What game was that?
That could have, it was either LIU or could have been Manhattan. I'm not sure.
It was like 7 points behind with like 21 seconds to go, and you ended up winning it in regulation time.
Who was the toughest people to coach against? Other coaches?
Well, anybody I had respect for as a coach. As you know, some of the great coaching names were as a result of a lot of publicity and having the media like you and so forth. But there was Jim McDermott at Iona and Danny Lynch at St. Francis and myself, and we were facetiously named the Little Three. And I knew that I would rather play the coach of NYU or any of the rest of them around than go against Danny Lynch at St. Francis or against Jimmy McDermott at Iona. They were great coaches. Lynch is dead. McDermott is very active in some phases of basketball.
How about Jimmy Phelan, Mount St. Mary's? You actually coached when he was a player. Do you remember him, Jimmy Phelan?
Yeah, I know. Remember, did he play with LaSalle College High?
LaSalle, yeah, college.
They had a great coach, Obie O'Brien. They had a great coach and a great ball player. He and I used to have some fun. They had a newspaperman coaches game up there as part of the Newport stuff, and Obie and I would put on a show.
Did you coach against Tom Goler in high school?
Yes, Tom Goler played with LaSalle College High in around 46, 47. And they beat us one year, and we beat them one year.
How about the Philadelphia schools? How'd you fare against Villanova, St. Joseph's, and the Big Five?
Villanova, we very seldom beat. I think we managed a couple of times in the Army, maybe not. St. Joseph's, we never beat. They would never come up here and play. We had to get down and play in a palestra. And the famous story there is they would play in Madison Square Garden, and the game would be on for 5 or 6 minutes, and the referee would make a call that their rooters didn't like, and this big codfish would come flying out of the balcony, big fish this big, and go plop on the floor. And everybody thought it was a great story. So we go down to the palestra. The same thing, we're leading, and then the referees went to work, and out comes a fish, plop on the floor. And in no time, the guy threw it, was on the way to his jail. No damn sense of humor at all. And what was his name, the red-headed guy I finally bounced off about?
George McNally?
Yeah. As a freshman, he was the one who threw the fish. Father, that's a great guy we should have mentioned, the Jesuit, Father Curtin. Had to go down to jail and get him freed in order to go home with us, for God's sake.
Wow.
I'm thinking about things that I haven't thought of for years, you know.
We played American University one night, and they had a 7'1" center named Art Beatty, and we had a 5'8" guard named Bob Leckie. Did you jump center game? What happened there?
Well, they came up and tried to put a little whammy on it. So it was in the Army. Half their team came over there, and my boys are shooting, and they were trying to get warmed up and ready, and they just stood there looking at us. And then that group went back, and the other half came down, and I said to the coach, "What the hell are you doing? Trying to psych us or whatever the hell it was?" And I got a kind of a surly answer. So when the game started, their 7'1" center found himself jumping against a 5'8" kid, and somehow or other we got the ball. We didn't get the jump, but I guess we stole the ball somehow or other.
I only have a few more questions. Your job as athletic director. What were some of the responsibilities you had aside from coaching basketball in your days as an administrator?
Well, I had charge of all sports and all the coaches, and we got as high as I think 14 sports while I was athletic director, and freshman teams and so forth. And I never had a bit of trouble with any of the coaches. It was a very nice situation. I had to fire one coach, but it was a question of me getting fired or him getting fired. He happened to be the swimming coach, and he was the coach of St. Peter's Prep. And he decided that he had a couple swimmers down there who were better than the varsity swimmers, and they were swimming against the Seton Hall or whoever, and he brought his prep kids up, and they represented St. Peter's College. He had no right to do it. And he was found out, and like I say, a friend of mine, I liked him, the guy was fine as far as I was concerned, but I had to fire him, or be fired myself.
About the crew team, you had a crew team here in the 60s.
What?
The crew team. Whatever happened to them?
It never really worked out. I remember we had a crew team. It lasted about 2 years or so. We even had a bicycle team. We had a sailing team, and so forth. We had one very rabid biker. Remember, blind guy, spoke with a German accent even.
Don't remember his name.
Yeah.
And you had Collins Gymnasium, which...
Yeah, Collins Gym. I actually, one of my first acts when I got to be coach was to enlarge the basketball floor somewhat. I did it by putting the baskets back and so forth, putting one basket on the stage. And I also put up 4 practice baskets around so that you really had 6 baskets. And of course nobody, like here, they tell the varsity you have from 3 to 4 to practice. They didn't tell me. If I wanted to practice till 8 o'clock, we practiced till 8 o'clock. So that was one advantage we had.
Hey, Robert, are you okay in there? Good. Has the tape switched? I'm sorry, what was that? Okay, great. Okay. How about that great sports information department? How'd they do in promoting the team and making sure you got press and all that great stuff to promote the college?
You mean Freddie Cranwell?
Yeah. A wonderful guy.
Well, we were very lucky to tack on to Fred. He was as faithful. His main job, I think, was sports publicity, right? He was the best around. And like I said, he decided that we were going to play pretty tough schedules, and we never turned down a game. And I still think to this day, now, the local coach was guilty of this a little bit. This is just a talk between us, right?
Sure.
It's not going over anything.
Well, we can edit it.
It is?
We can cut it out. Yeah.
Well, then I'm not going to say what I was going to say.
No, you can.
I was going to say, well, let's say this.
That's fine.
Our idea was play the best teams you can play. And to my idea, that still means that you're going to be better. Now, if you play poorer teams than you are, you're going to get down to their level. You're going to play worse. See? In other words, it's a wrong idea to try to weaken your schedule. It's been tried here and has not been successful.
Well, last question I have is, Natcher retired 1972, last game. How would you describe, what were some of your finest moments, and how do you reflect on your St. Peter's experience overall? What were some of the great things?
Well, I always consider myself very lucky to have become connected with St. Peter's. My history as a basketball coach is that I always coached, underdog isn't a good word, but I never coached the type team where you could go out and get the best players in the country and so forth. And in a way, in high school and in college, in a way, I had to try to make ball players better. And that worked out all the way. And I always liked the idea, for instance, we said before that the people thought I was going to coach Fordham. I was always very glad that I coached St. Peter's instead of Fordham and so forth.
So are we.
Yes. Amen. Mr. Cranwell?
I can't add to that. I think I'm just very happy that we had this basketball giant as part of our history.
Yes.
And he made us what we are today.
Yes, with the help of an awful lot of great guys.
I think
Great
that Don
people.
Kennedy is probably the greatest individual non-Jesuit in the history of St. Peter's College.
I agree. I agree.
Thank you.